Hello, everybody. Welcome to World History. Today we're going to be talking about something very exciting. We're going to be talking about the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. This is really going to lead to some interesting ideas and some interesting things that have happened throughout world history. This is where we get things like the guillotine and the questions of when is it ever okay to rebel against your government? And are kings a good idea? Should we have representative governments? Is it better to have something like like a dictator with absolute power? What is the best form of government? We're going to go through it in this chapter, and this is going to be a very exciting time in world history. However, before we get there, let's talk about kind of the context in which all these events happen, especially the Enlightenment. We talked about a lot of different things that happened in European history since the Middle Ages. And what ends up happening is we somewhat tend to forget that a lot of these things are happening all at the same time. When they're written down in a history book, sometimes we forget that a lot of these events are occurring simultaneously and that they're affecting each other. Let's talk about the things that we've talked about since we started talking about life since the Middle Ages in Europe specifically. We talked about the Renaissance, which started in about 1300s. This would be kind of the official start of the modern age, and that's kind of funny to think about 700 years ago being modern, but in terms of, the naming conventions, this is kind of the official end of the medieval age or the Middle Ages. Then we had the Age of Exploration. Remember, that's when we had Spain and Portugal going out into the New World, places like North and South America. Then we also had them trading along, southern and eastern Africa and with countries over in the East Indies as well. That's happening at this time period too. Then we also had the Reformation, which began in 1517. That's happening at the same time as the Age of Exploration and the Scientific Revolution. All of these, big changes are happening all at once. This is where we have people disagreeing on, which form of Christianity to follow. We have Catholicism, and then we have the Protestant churches, but even the Protestant churches have different denominations that are going against each other, and it's leading to a lot of wars and political instability, ending with what's known as the 30 Years' War, which happened in this area of Europe, which is now mostly Germany, but a lot of other countries, modern day countries as well. And this is kind of the height of that religious tension, which leads to all-out warfare. And then we also have the scientific revolution going on at the same time. So there's a lot of ways in which people's ideas about the past have been changing. We had kind of this idea that we need to reform the faith, that we need to reform Christianity, and that the people who are leading it, the Catholic Church and the priests and the bishops and all that they were doing a poor job. So we needed to overthrow their religious authority. And this throws, this whole political situation into complete chaos. And then at the same time, we have the scientific revolution, that many of the ideas about science that we've had up until this time were incorrect, and that they could be changed, and that we could understand the physical world better. All these things are going to lead to what's known as the Enlightenment. But another big idea and some trend that was happening during this time was something called absolute monarchy. This was a government led by one person with absolute power, and it was hereditary, and they had something called the divine right of kings. So this was the idea that a lot of people had, basically, that God chose the monarch, who was going to be the king, the queen, the emperor, the empress, whatever you want to say, that because everything was basically preordained and that God chose who would be the king or queen, that you would have to listen to them. So even if they seemed irrational or maybe didn't have the best ideas or did something that you disagreed with, but because they had that divine right, you had to listen to what they said. Now, let's go back to world history and things that we talked about way back at the beginning of the year. Does this remind you of anything that we talked about? I'll give you 1 second. Put your reply in the comments. Okay, so what we talked about was in ancient China how they had the mandate of heaven. This was also a similar idea at around much later in history. But this kind of idea has sprung up before in different places, that it's whoever is ruling has that right, basically ordained by God or by heaven or some higher power, that they should be in there. And so this is really what's going to lead to a lot of problems and a lot of tensions, especially in France. And it's what's going to lead to a revolution. Because we have to, a lot of the people who are very religious at this time have to debate whether or not it's like, okay, so this ruler is doing things I disagree with, and I don't think they should be in power, but they were also put in place there, by God. So what should I do? The Age of Enlightenment. So philosophers believed that they could apply the scientific method and use reason to logically explain human nature and to make society better. So we could use the scientific method and a lot of things that were happening during the scientific revolution, and instead of figuring out maybe how the earth moved around the sun or something like that, that we could also use the scientific method of hypothesis and experimentation to figure out how humans worked, to figure out, what government was the best. And the Enlightenment specifically is an intellectual movement in the late 17th and 18th centuries, which remember means 1600s to 1700s, and it emphasized reason and individualism rather than tradition. The Enlightenment is going to inspire a lot of different political ideas that are going to become very important, including the ones that end up creating the government of the United States of America and the American Revolution. A lot of it's going to come from Enlightenment values, and also the French Revolution. I think the popular conception today is that the American Revolution is kind of Enlightenment values done right, and the French Revolution is Enlightenment values gone wrong. We're going to talk about why they ended up that way. So what are some characteristics of the Enlightenment? Well, they believed everything had a cause and effect. Everything could be rationally and logically explained, and that was called rationalism. So basically the truth, or what is real, can be arrived at solely by reason or logical thinking. We can figure everything out in the universe if we just apply rational thought to it. If we test it out, we can figure things out that were meant to just be, it's like, oh, that's just the way things are. The Enlightenment is basically the opposite of that. It's like, no, that's not the way things are. This is why it happened, and this is how we can change it. It's not just, oh, that's just the way it is. They believed in natural law. They believed there was order to the universe, and that if we can discover how society works, we can make society more fair and orderly. This is where we have people kind of thinking about, why do we have the nobility? Why do we have people who are super rich while most people are very poor? It's like, why do we have this system in place in the first time? In the first place? Why do we have this system? Is there any way that we can make things more fair and more equal for other people? And instead of just, well, that's just, the way things are because it's just been preordained that way, it's like, no, we can change it and make it better. So who are the people who are really the ones who started what is known as the Enlightenment? They were called Philosophers, or, philosophers in English. That's just the French word for it. So the Philosophers were philosophers and critics of society. They wrote plays, pamphlets, newspapers, and encyclopedias. The encyclopedia was written at this time because it was the first reference book that kind of contained all the major aspects of human knowledge at the time altogether. So the first encyclopedia is made at this time for the Enlightenment. And they had writings which criticized things like the church, the government, things like the slave trade, torture, taxes, and war, things that had just kind of been set in stone with the ideas of, slave trade. It's like, why do we trade slaves? Well, that's just the way it's always been. And the Enlightenment kind of comes around and says, wait a second, like, do these people have value or not? Not just value in terms of how many dollars you can trade for it, but is there a value to human life in a way that we can actually not put a price on? And this also comes to things like torture. It's like, is it morally justifiable to torture somebody? Well, before it wasn't even really thought of. It was just, we need to, we have won, this war, even things to war. It's like, why even fight war in the first place? It's like, to the victor goes the spoils. It's just kind of what happens. And they thought, well, is there a way that we can actually fight or, avoid war in the first place or fight wars in a way that's more morally justifiable. So it's kind of rethinking all these things that had just been the way of the world for a long time. So a lot of the things that we would think of as being, barbaric or cruel about world history are starting to be rethought. It's like, why should, after we finish, conquering a city, should we go in and burn the whole place down and loot and rampage and steal? It's like, can't we just, talk about it instead? So another interesting example of kind of a way of thinking about the Enlightenment that I was thinking of when I was first teaching this earlier today was when it came to characteristics of enlightenment and believing that everything has a cause and effect in rationalism. I thought of the example of Scooby Doo, for example. Scooby Doo, believe it or not, might be the best way of kind of thinking about the Enlightenment and rationalism, because what happens in many early episodes of Scooby Doo, that there's something spooky, there's something mysterious that's driving people away because they don't want to deal with something that's haunted, and then the gang shows up, Scooby and Shaggy and the whole Mystery Machine gang. They come, Mystery Incorporated, I'm sorry. So they come around and then they basically show, wait, what you thought was a ghost or something else was actually just a guy in a mask. It's that we can explain things rationally rather than thinking everything is haunted or spooky. So that's something to where it's like that shows kind of Enlightenment values in a nutshell in kind of in a fun way. Maybe next time I teach this, I will have a picture of Scooby and Shaggy right here instead of Immanuel Kant. Who has done more to affect Western society? Immanuel Kant or Shaggy and Scooby? And I'll let you guys mull that over. Thank you guys for joining me today, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.